Hi, so this is a quick tutorial slash overview of the functions in the Ultimate Trace plugin. I have a longer tutorial on my YouTube. You can also check it out on the marketplace to get a link. That kind of goes into detail, and it's long for each trace function. But in here, I'm just gonna quickly go through some settings and general overview of the most complicated traces, just to give you kind of an idea how to use them. And if at any point you just want to kind of figure out what they do and how they work, you have my demo level. In the demo level, you have the level blueprints, and when you open this, you have my setup for each of them, so you can kind of check how I use them to showcase them in the demo level. And at any point, of course, you can go into demo level, just stand on the platform and see the traces and how they interact. I try to make it simple to kind of use and see and understand. So in here you can see I give you the different options and how they interact with the objects that they hit. So yeah, please, if you have any like confusion around how some trace works, just going to the demo level. It should give you like a good idea of what's happening. And also you can message me on the marketplace page. You have the link and stuff like that, so you can leave me a comment or a message or whatever and ask questions. But yeah, so I wanted to just go through each of not each, but through most of the, I guess, complicated or maybe confusing traces to kind of give you a general idea. In the more detailed tutorial, it's around 35 minutes. I go into the detail of each one and then I showcase it, show you exactly how it works. But in here, I just want to quickly show you what's happening. So first, usually from most like components, you can get the over location and forward vector or up vector. And for a lot of them, you can just use that. Or if you want like your player location, player direction vector, or you can just type even here like to get some world directions. But for most of them, you have like just location direction vector, and you can easily plug in those things there. Also, all of them have these trace settings. You can split this, or you can make the struct and just edit the settings. This is just something that all of the traces have, which is debug type, trace colors, draw time, stuff like that. So you can set that up for each of them. So yeah, let's go through each of them. So we have bone line trace and bone sphere trace. I'm not going to show sphere trace because it basically works the same. It's just a sphere. You have radius additional option. But how it works is you get your skeletal mesh. So we can do this guy, connect it in a skeletal mesh, so we know from which skeleton to find the bone. Then we type in the name of the bone. We click the trace length, then the axis of the bone. So if your bone looks like this, let's say, this would be like x-axis, this would be minus x, then you have the other, which would be y and z and stuff like that. Depends on how your character is rigged. You can change it in here. Then you have just the visibility, what you want to trace, camera visibility from that bone, and you have the return. Most of the time return is hit result or hit results, which is an array, and then sometimes you have some checks, so if you even hit something or you did not hit something. And you also can use the arrays as a check. So in here I can type length, and if the length is 0, that means I didn't hit anything, and if it's something more, then we did hit something. So yeah, that's the bone trace. Then we have the camera trace. In here you just need the camera component and trace length, and it's just gonna cast 4 rays from the camera, and that's about it. And this is of course FOV and aspect ratio independent. So if your screen is like this, or if your screen is like this, let's say, doesn't matter, we are still gonna cast from the corners, same as any aspect ratio. Then we have class line trace. This basically means you select a specific class, so maybe you only want this line trace to work for a specific character or something, or maybe for the rifle, you can select it in here. You have your trace lengths. This is something that you would have for most of them. Whichever has like direction usually will have a trace length. So points won't have the trace length, but most of them will. And then you have your classic location direction vector, and that's about it. And if you hit any classes, you have this found boolean. Then we have path line trace. This basically means you give it a number of points. You can manually give it points, so you can make an array and it's going to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however you want them. And then it's going to trace in between them, and whenever it hits something, it's going to give you that hit result and stop tracing. So if you have, let's say you have 4 points and there is an object in here, so it's going to trace from this object to this. It's going to try to go to this object, but it's going to hit something and it's going to say, okay, I found something, and then end the function there, so it's not going to continue casting. So that's kind of one thing there. And here you can use also maybe navigation path points or whatever you want, or you can of course create manually, so you can just add them however you want. Then we have filter sphere trace. This one is a bit complicated, but basically how it works is that you have this pass option, and then you have a type of test that you want to do. So scale up basically means if you have a, let's say you want to test this hole, and you want to test bigger and bigger sizes to see generally what size of the hole this is. What you could do is start from the smaller one, test bigger, you basically casting inside here, so bigger and bigger, until you come to the size that is big enough, and it's going to try to pass through. It's not going to be able to pass, and then it's going to say, okay, we found the location of the biggest one. Now, if let's say this is the biggest size, but this size is still able to pass here, and you don't hit anything, and we kind of finish the filter trace, it's going to say we failed to pass, we didn't find anything. And then you have the scale down. Scale down basically works the opposite. It starts from the biggest one, and it will return past only if it doesn't hit anything. So the first pass, when you start from smaller to bigger, it passes when it does hit something. But this one, the biggest one is going to hit, and then it's going to test the smaller one, and when one of them doesn't hit anything, it's going to pass. So that's kind of the difference, and it goes from the minimum size to the maximum size, or the opposite. If you are scaling up, it goes from 2, then you have size steps, so it's going to be 2 plus 5 is 7. You can of course change, you can start from 25 and have step to be like 1 or something. So it's going to start from the minimum size, and going to add size steps until it gets to the maximum size. Or if you're using scale down, it's going to start from maximum size. It's going to take out these size steps until it goes to the minimum size. So that's kind of basically how it works. Then you have illuminator line trace, which basically means we have the object type. This is basically just whatever object or collision type you want to test. So do you want to kind of test when the illumination will start? Do you want to start that when you hit like a wall or something, or you want a character? And how this basically works is you have a initial line trace, and if you hit something, we send ray traces in random directions, and you get some hits here, and you get this if you got the initial hit. So that's kind of how this works. Now you have this additional scatter settings, which basically means all of the settings, because we have the two different line traces. We have the initial one that tests if you hit something, and then we have a bunch of them that scatter later. So you can change the initial trace length, and then you can change the trace length of the scatter, so you can make them bigger, smaller, whatever you want. And then you have the count. If you want to randomly scatter 100 rays, 10 rays, 1 ray, you can do it in here. And then you have the trace settings, which you also have for this initial trace. So this is probably the most complicated one, because you have this whole additional settings list. Then we have the multi-bounce line trace. This basically means that if you hit something, so we cast a trace, and let's say there is an object in here. If you hit that object, it's gonna cast the reflection ray. If you hit another thing, it's gonna cast another ray. Maybe you hit something else, it's gonna trace. And this the amount of bounces is gonna depend on the bounce count, and then the reflection trace length, basically this guy, or these traces, the length of them, it's gonna depend on this. Or it's going to depend on this reflection trace length, and then you have the trace length for the initial array. So maybe you want the initial array to be length of 1000, but then maybe bounces need to be 500 or something. So that's kind of up to you here. And then the last one that we have is the threshold multi-line trace. This basically means so firstly, all multi-line traces or multi-sphere traces or whatever, they only go through objects that are set to overlap. So if you have, let's say, 3 objects and they are all set to overlap, it's gonna go through all of them and consider all of them. But let's say the first object is set to block, it's gonna hit the first object, stop there, and just consider that one object. So that's just one thing that you need to consider with multi-line multi-traces. And in here, how this works is basically you set a threshold. So let's say we set the threshold to 1. What we're basically saying is, if we hit the first guy, we're going to say our threshold is not passed. We're going to hit the second guy and we're going to say, okay, this is bigger than the threshold 1, so we did pass, and we can, yes, even hit the third one if you want. So it needs to be basically 1 or greater, and then it's basically passing the test. So that's for the threshold. For it, you can change it. You can say 3, 5, however many objects you want this to pass through to be considered for this line trace to pass. So yeah, these are the most complicated one. Some other ones that we have are directional traces, which basically just work like any other trace. You just have location, direction, and the trace length. So they're pretty simple. I didn't want to go over that because they're pretty simple. But yeah, that's kind of about it. The other thing, so you can type ultimate trace whenever you want and get the list of all the traces from this plugin. And one other thing that you have here is local offset location and offset direction. That's basically used for location here and the direction here. If you want to slightly offset them, you can easily use this function that I'm offering here. But other than that, that's basically it, the most complicated functions that you just need to know about. And of course, keep in mind, at any point, go to demo map and just test things out.